Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I kind of wanted to make another video following up on my Saturday hodgepodge video in which I gave a history lesson which I attempted to connect the Jim Crow system of controlling African American lives with lynchings to the current attention we pay to police killings of African Americans. And I was kind of inspired, I was inspired to make this video by Alicia from Pretty Brown Eye Reader, who left a comment on my original video Saturday, in which she pointed out that racism wasn't something just a problem in the South, quite rightly so, and so I wanted to make a video addressing that because, as she indicates, if we just think about racism as a Southern problem, then we really aren't seeing racism for the systemic nationwide problem it is. So I wanted to address that, but also Wendy from BookNerdTV posted, I believe yesterday or early this morning, a really, what I thought was just an incredibly powerful video about, just her reactions to what's going on. And in that, she points out that, it's not really up to African American people to solve this problem, that it's up to white America to solve this problem of systemic racism in the United States of America. And if you've been watching any of the videos from African American booktubers, black booktubers from around the world, one of the first things they say is, don't come to us and ask us to educate you. Educate yourself. And so this is, for me, a way of doing that, of talking to white viewers about things that are reality, have been the reality in the United States for quite some time. Beginning in the late 19th century, primarily as mechanical equipment began to replace the need for human labor on farms in the South, and as a reaction to the increasingly violent racism and the rising number of lynchings in the South, and industrialization taking place in northern cities and Midwestern cities, African Americans began moving from the South in really record migratory numbers to cities in the Northeast and the Midwest and in California, searching for jobs, searching for greater freedom, searching for, a world less violent than the one they found. And while I do think there is a difference between life in the South in, let's say, 1895 and life in Chicago in 1895, they don't find all the opportunities and freedoms and freedom from violence that they expected to, because what they found in those cities is growing resentment among the white population for this growing African American population, resentment about competition for jobs. And what they found was that, just as was true in the South, white people owned all the property, and white people controlled then where they could live. They had segregation through, leasing agreements and rent control, and so that African Americans, for instance, who moved to New York found themselves almost exclusively only able to live in Harlem. There was a time during this Great Migration where Harlem was the most densely populated place on earth, where apartment buildings were divided and then subdivided because it's the only place in cities like New York African Americans could live. A similar thing happens on the south side of Chicago as the African American population of Chicago grows. In 1919, there was a wave of racist violence which swept across the United States. And it wasn't just in the South. As a matter of fact, it happened everywhere. Just to give you one example, the worst race riot, I believe, in the history of Chicago took place in 1919, in which eventually 38 African American people were killed by white mobs who roamed through African American neighborhoods, beating and killing African Americans randomly on the street. This whole thing was set off by the death of a young African American boy who inadvertently swam from the African American area of a beach on Lake Michigan into a white area, and the white citizens of Chicago essentially stoned him to death by throwing rocks at him until he lost consciousness, I believe, and drowned. That then set off a reaction in the African American community, which was met by violence from the majority white community, and lots of people died, and that's Chicago. Many people, I think, are increasingly aware of the race riot, the worst race riot in American history, that took place in Tulsa, in the African American neighborhood, I believe called Greenwood, in Tulsa in 1921, during which as many as 138 African American people may have been killed and hundreds others injured. To be honest with you, we still don't know the total toll of that riot which took place, because it was hidden for so long. And much of that African American neighborhood was burned down, and the memory of what happened there erased, and that was Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yesterday I read a poem by Nikki Giovanni about Rosa Parks, and in that poem Giovanni points out that the really important Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended segregation in public schools and said that separate isn't equal, she pointed out quite importantly that case came from the school system in Topeka, Kansas. You know, it was from the West, not from the South, and they chose that case on purpose. The NAACP chose that case on purpose to highlight the fact that segregation was not just a Southern thing, and racism was not just a Southern thing. That this went on, throughout the United States. You know, if we fast forward to the 1960s, we think about the 1960s, we think about all kinds of things, happening with the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and the 1960s, but the 1960s were also a period of time in which protests and rioting broke out in African American neighborhoods as a result of, guess what, police brutality, or African American young men dying in the hands of the police. Probably the most famous of those being the Watts riot, which took place in the primarily African American neighborhood of Los Angeles, which began after a young African American man died mysteriously in police custody. And that's Los Angeles, California. And if you just want to stay with Los Angeles, you can find dozens of examples of police brutality and police killing of African American. Maybe perhaps a more modern example of police brutality in Los Angeles was the Rodney King beating in the 1990s, in which a group of police officers viciously beat Rodney King, who was literally tied up and on the ground and all by himself. And they beat him, and those officers were found not guilty of doing anything wrong. And if you think about it, because it's reality, that distrust of the Los Angeles Police Department and the belief that police department was racist also explains in part the verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial. So, this murder of George Floyd that happened in Minneapolis is not an outlier. This kind of racism and racist violence, or violence against African Americans and killings of African Americans by the police, and racist violence is not something that just happened in the South. It happened everywhere. And thank you, Alicia, for pointing that out to me, so that I could hopefully correct some of that here and provide that information. Because again, I don't think that we in the white community can really confront the reality of the systemic racism that exists in the United States until we know and educate ourselves about the long history, and that it's a nationwide problem and not a regional problem. I also wanted to fill in kind of a little blank I left in the history I did on Saturday. I went from slavery to Jim Crow and segregation, and talked about how segregation, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, lynching were all kind of this three-part system that white Southerners created to give themselves control over African Americans. I think most people in the United States of America are aware that in the 1960s, by law and sometimes by constitutional amendment, the United States government eliminated legal forms of segregation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 being the most sweeping of those, followed up by the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Voting Rights Act, a very important Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been under assault, I'm just going to say it, by the Republican Party for at least the last 10 years, in which we see continuing heading into the 2020 election. That happened in 1965. And so what a lot of people believe, I think, and what a lot of white Americans don't understand is that, yes, those laws, those actions essentially got rid of that second system that white America had created for controlling African Americans, that system of segregation and Jim Crow, which was backed by the violence of lynchings. But that system was replaced by a new system, a subtler system, a less overt system, a system which now took on names and trappings of things that sounded positive. And this begins with Nixon and Nixon's promise to return the United States to law and order. And law and order politics in the late 60s, early 70s, as practiced by Nixon, had two objectives. One was to shut up peace protesters and Vietnam protesters and kind of shut down that kind of leftist hippie protesting movement. But second, and in lots of ways most important to Nixon, it was also intended to shut down the civil rights movement, and particularly the increasingly outspoken, strident voice of the civil rights movement as represented by groups like the Black Panthers. And so when Nixon talked about law and order, he was talking about literally getting protesters off the streets and shutting down these groups. Ethically, unethically, legally, illegally, whatever he could do to shut these groups down. And so the FBI aimed a lot of its attention at the Black Panthers, and lots of Black Panther leaders were arrested and imprisoned on trumped-up drug charges. Some Black Panther leaders were assassinated by the FBI. And this then brings me to talking about how the war on drugs is actually a part of this systemic policing, racist policing of the African American community, because Nixon made no bones about it, that we now know that Nixon saw the war on drugs as a way to criminalize African American political organizations and to use these drug laws then to imprison and shut down African American civil rights groups. And in the process, tens of thousands of African American men were sent to prison on all kinds of drug charges. This carries over then in the 1980s with Reagan and his war on drugs and his attempts to try to control drugs. But in reality, most of those drug enforcement ideas were focused on the African American communities, which is ironic, since during the Reagan administration, the CIA more or less helped Nicaraguan drug dealers smuggle cocaine into the United States and turn it into crack and then sell it in places, primarily African American neighborhoods in big cities like South Central Los Angeles, which also then destroyed families. But this again is a part of the systemic racism. And what we begin to see in the 1980s was that frequently when we talked about law and order, the face of the people we wanted to control, the group of people we wanted to enforce these laws on in people's imagination and people's minds were quite frequently and almost exclusively African Americans. This then continued on in 1988, in the 1988 presidential election. Vice President and the Republican candidate George H.W. Bush ran an ad attacking his Democratic opponent Michael Dukakis, who had been the governor of Massachusetts, for a furlough program which he used to end overcrowding in prisons. It's called the Willie Horton ad, and the Willie Horton ad is a clearly racist advertisement designed to instill fear in white voters. In the 90s, we had the crime bill, which further criminalized a lot of drug behavior and resulted in the imprisonment, again, of tens of thousands of African American men on relatively minor drug charges. And so when you see President Trump on a daily basis now tweet in all caps the words law and order, what he's talking about today are shutting down protests about the killing, the murder at the hands of a police officer of an African American man. He is again trying to rally the white population of the United States against these protests, and he's using these kind of coded racist language from the 1960s and 1970s to attempt to rally his base so that he can be reelected in November. And one of the things then that we're also seeing in these as a result of all these protests is how militarized the United States police forces have become. We have turned them into these heavily armed people with massive body armor and riot shields and all kinds of ways of dispersing crowds and protesters with, heavy firepower and all kinds of tactical vehicles. And this indicates that we have essentially empowered the police to solve our problems for us militarily, which really isn't what the police should be doing. So when you see calls to defund the police, you need to be aware that, pretty much nobody thinks that we're going to end up with 0 policemen. What those calls to defund the police are really about rethinking the way the police operate and rethinking the mission of the police, because the police are clearly, the system of police in the United States today is clearly a part of the systemic racism that we see in the United States. And unless we rethink that system with ideas like defunding the police, that's not going to change. Trump and the Republican Party are right now working to make you afraid of the idea of defunding the police. This is something that will lead to anarchy, and they're trying to make you afraid. What defunding the police really means is taking away the responsibilities that we've given to the police for things that they never should have had responsibility for. For instance, police clear the streets of homeless people. Well, couldn't we take the money we use for policemen to clear the streets of the homeless to create more shelters and more social workers to help the homeless? The police enforce drug laws and arrest people who are on drugs or dealing drugs. Couldn't we then put that money that we use for the police to enforce those laws into social work or rehab or other kinds of programs? Defunding the police really means taking away some of their jobs so that they aren't in this position to exercise racist violence against African Americans, to demilitarize the police, to stop selling, to have the United States government stop selling the police old military equipment, which they can only be expected to use then to put down, well, mass protests, which are our First Amendment rights. So, I'm not sure that defunding the police is the answer. I don't know enough about it, but what I do know is that if your knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh no, we can't defund the police, we have to keep what we have, then you are, in effect, still supporting systemic racism, and that we need to at least embrace the idea, explore that idea, because something has to change. Anyway, there you go. That's the end of my history lessons. Thank you for watching.